Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture on classical conception of culture. This lecture is part of your paper on media, culture and society. In this lecture you will learn about the classical meaning of culture. The idea classical refers to civilizational meaning of culture. In a way, it will provide you an idea about the evolution of the term and its trajectory in Europe. Besides, it will also make an attempt to locate it in Indian context by taking seminal contributions by scholars in India. The reason for studying the theoretical trajectory of the concept of culture arises as it has tremendous implications in understanding communication. Therefore, any student of communication studies must be informed about the developments in the conceptualization of culture and communication. Through this lecture, you will also learn the origin of the term and its use in both European and the Indian context. The idea behind this lecture is to make you understand various debates and scholarly engagements across the world in making the sense of culture. When you hear the word culture, you may refer the term to objects, cultural artifacts such as terracotta pots, scriptures, sculptures, paintings, and many more. In fact, museums also present a cultural history through artifacts. You may also speak of culture in terms of cultural events such as farewell parties, birthday parties, marriage functions, musical nights, so on and so forth. Along with these, you may speak of Indian culture in terms of its higher achievements of religion, philosophy, forms of music, dance and drama. You may use the term Indian culture to refer to Indian civilization. All these usages indicate to refinements of Indian civilization. In addition to refinements of civilization, people tend to think of culture in terms of personal refinements when they speak of cultured people. Commonsensically, we differentiate between a cultured person and an uncultured person, or a high class and a low class person. We speak of cultural manners which are inculcated into children through specialization in family, peer group and educational institutions. All these meanings of culture as civilization, civilized people, cultured people, well-mannered people, these are all integral part of the classical conception of culture. We refer it as classical because it is one of the oldest ways of defining culture that is informed by our commonsensical knowledge system. It's also known as civilizational meaning of culture, as culture and civilization were used synonymously. Now let's first discuss how the classical meaning of culture developed in the 18th century Europe. After this, we will discuss the elements of classical meanings of culture in the Indian context within the social science tradition. Raymond Williams, in his book of Keywords, Vocabulary of Culture in Society, says that the early meaning of the word culture is related to idea of cultivation. In fact, the English word culture is derived from the Latin word cultura, which means cultivation of tending of something, or as crops or animals. The word agriculture itself consists of the word culture. This means that the early meaning of culture was linked primarily to husbandry. The possible reason for the development of such meaning is that the European society in the 16th century was primarily an agricultural society yet to witness industrial revolution. Hence, people define themselves through their participation and non-participation in agricultural production. Gradually, from the early 16th century onwards, the original meaning extended from the sphere of husbandry to the process of human development. This shift was a major jump from the cultivation of crops to cultivation of mind. Along with English language and French language also, the word culture was used in similar fashion. By the middle of the 18th century, the independent noun civilization emerged. The independent noun first appeared in French and English languages. It was used to describe a progressive process of human development. In both English and French, culture and civilization were used synonymously to describe a process of becoming civilized or cultivated. Behind this civilizational development lies the spirit of European Enlightenment. Civilization was associated with the notion of task of civilizing others. The meaning of culture should be seen in association with the colonizing mission of the British and French rules. Unlike French and English language, in German language too, these words were used, contrasted in a way that civilization, the German word for civilization, connotes a negative meaning, and culture, a German word for culture, a positive meaning. Civilization has a negative connotation because it was associated with mannerisms, while culture refers to the intellectual and artistic products to express that creativity of people. This contrast in the meaning of these two terms were linked to the patterns of social satisfaction in Europe and prevalent during that period. In 18th century Germany, French was the language of the courtly nobility. Thus, speaking French was a status symbol of the upper strata. Distinct from the upper classes, there was a small German-speaking stratum of intellectual. These intellectuals conceived of their activities in terms of intellectual and artistic achievement. This intelligentsia derided the upper classes for achieving nothing but only refining manners and imitating French. This polemic against the upper class was expressed in the term of the contrast between culture, and civilization. Immanuel Kant, the German Enlightenment thinker, remarked, "We become civilized by acquiring a variety of social graces and refinements," unquote. So you can see that German intelligentsia, who are primarily Enlightenment thinkers, use the word culture to distinguish itself from upper classes because these intelligentsia were excluded from the courtly life. This was not the case in France. The French intelligentsia were assimilated in the courtly life. Such contrast can be seen again when we use the word civilization to refer to advanced or high cultures. Sometimes we use the word civilization chiefly for literate cultures. In this sense, the oral traditions appear inferior to literary cultures. And this way of theorizations are still continued around us. In fact, when culture was used in relation to civilization, it didn't completely reject the civilization of mind thesis. The whole movement towards rationality was actually seemingly relying on the cultivation of mind. The vocabulary of culture and civilization provided by enlightenment should be seen in relation to the decline of feudalism and emergence of capitalism in Europe. This shift from cultivation of crops and animals to cultivation of mind also reflects this shift from agricultural production to factory production. So agricultural production became inferior and factory production became a sign of advancement of civilization. Therefore, feudal elements of culture became center of criticism. So more or less by the early 19th century, the word culture was either used as synonym or in contrast to civilization. These meanings of culture and civilization didn't wither away with the passage of time. Colonialism gave them a new life in new context of social practices and colonies. India was one of the colonies of the British Empire, as you know. So let us move into the discussion on the development of cultural discourse in India that borrowed several elements of classical conception of culture. Putting all this together, cultivation of mind, cultivation of manners, becoming civilized, refinements of manners, appreciating art, music and literature, all these are integral aspects of classical conceptions of culture. John Thompson defines classical conception of culture in these words, I quote, "Culture is the process of developing and ennobling the human faculties, a process facilitated by the assimilation of works of scholarship and art and linked to the progressive character of modern era," unquote. This definition has three important aspects that we have already narrated. Culture as process of developing and ennobling human faculties. Culture is a process facilitated by the assimilation of works of scholarship and art. Culture is linked to the progressive character of modern era reflected in enlightenment. Renowned Indian social scientist Professor Yogendra Singh says, I quote, "The discourse on culture has a history in India as old as the civilization," unquote. He offers a very important formulation that the social scientific study of culture in India corresponds with the British establishment of the British rule and the rise of the national movement. Hence, any discussion on culture in India is carried out in relation to British nationalism or nationalist struggle in India. The colonial discourse on culture in India had three distinct orientations: the missionary, the Orientalist, and the utilitarian. In simple language, Orientalism means the Western or European construction of the non-Western societies such as Africa and Asia. Orientalist and nationalist discourses used Indian culture and Indian civilization synonymously. Hence, many Indian social scientists have used the word culture synonymously with Indian civilization. Let's discuss some of the studies on culture in India that contains the various aspects of classical conceptions of culture. Interestingly, one of the cultural discourses in India was civilizational approach culture. As the name suggests, this approach to culture studies culture in India through the civilization perspective. This approach emphasizes on cataloging the cultural traits, cultural essence, and cultural communication to understand the Indian civilization. Here you can notice the overlapping of usages of culture and civilization. Three scholars are credited to develop this approach in India: N.K. Bose, Surajit Sinha, and Bernard S. Cohn. Both Bose and Sinha analyzed changes among tribals in India. They studied the vanishing tribal culture within the totality of Indian civilization. So they both tried to develop the notion of Indian civilization as against European civilization. The Indian civilization, according to such scholars and nationalists, was in sharp contrast to European civilization in terms of its continuity and unity in diversity. These were the predominant themes of the civilizational perspective. The continuity as well as the unity of Indian civilization, despite plurality of cultures, was also located within the classical Vedic texts. In this regard, another Indian scholar, Professor D.P. Mukherjee, argues in his book Sociology of Indian Culture that Indian culture is equated with Hindu philosophy. This equation has its roots in the Orientalist discourse led by the European scholars who mainly focused on philosophical texts, Vedas and Upanishads, to construct Indian culture. Rather, Kumud Mukherjee, in his book The Fundamental Unity of India, has emphasized the cultural unity of Hindu India, referring to it the notion of Akhand Bharat. He pointed out that pilgrimages to the extreme corners of this continent brought its diverse people into physical and mental contact in an age when communications were very difficult. The use of Sanskrit of all ceremonial occasions made for cultural hegemonity. Mukherjee argues that this conceptualization of Indian culture offered by Mukherjee excludes any contribution of Muslims. Mukherjee used cultural unity in terms of the geographical boundaries. The geographical boundaries of Indian, in terms of enduring Indian civilization. As already mentioned, Oriental and national scholarship promoted and relied on such meanings of culture in India. This scholarship identifies the modern nation state of India with the India of historical imagination. Here, India is a designation of a cultural region, is a Western constructed borrowed by nationalist leaders. The first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, referred to this aspect when he wrote a letter to Premier of People's Republic of China, Chou Enlai, during the dispute over the boundaries between India and China. Chou Enlai had argued that the boundaries between India and China are the creation of imperialist rule. Jawaharlal Nehru refuted this argument, insisting that the boundaries of India had been settled centuries before the coming of the British by history, geography, custom, and tradition. Anyone with a knowledge of history would know that the frontier of India is traditional and has been associated with India's culture and tradition for the past 2,000 years or so, and has been an intimate part of India's life and thought. This point was substantiated with detailed textual references in a white paper prepared by the Historical Division of the Ministry of External Affairs. A quotation from the Vishnu Puran was invoked to support Nehru's formulation that the country south of the Himalayas and north of the ocean is called Bharat, and all born in it were called Bharatiyas or Indians. Similar references were given from the Rig Veda, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and other Sanskrit texts, all pointing to the cultural and political unity of India. The Western construction of India was identified within the classical religious texts. In the classical text, the cultural unity of India corresponds to the geographical unity of India, which Radhamukund Mukherjee used in the sociological word. To quote Professor Singh, I quote, "In contemporary India, discourse on culture with the self-consciousness of identity is tied to its historical unfolding as a nation state. It has its beginning in colonial discourse on culture," unquote. You will find that this exercise of finding the boundaries of a modern nation state in ancient religious texts. There were many other nationalist leaders also referred on such discourse on Indian culture and civilization. In their attempt to oppose colonial power, many nationalist leaders resorted to revivalism of Vedic traditions. Swami Dayananda Saraswati inaugurated a cultural discourse based on the Vedic traditions. Sri Aurobindo, who aimed at modernization of Indian tradition based on the traditions of Gita, Vedas, and Upanishads. There were other streams of cultural discourse that challenged this Vedic revivalism. Jyotiba Phule, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, E.V. Ramaswamy could be mentioned among those who were prominent leaders propagating an alternative discourse which is far more inclusive and critical of the philosophy of Varna Ashram Dharma central to Vedic philosophy. Similarly, women like Savitribai Phule, Pandita Ramabai, and Tarabai Shinde rejected patriarchal tone of the cultural nationalism. It shows that the diversity in Indian traditions in India. Now let's look at the other element of classical conception in cultural discourses in India, that is cultivating or civilizing or refining the man. We still use this meaning of culture in our day-to-day life. When we use culture in the sense of civilization of cultured people, we are actually using it within a framework of hierarchy. Let's explain this to you with the Sanskrit word Sanskriti, which can be used as a translation of the English word culture. The word Sanskriti also has the similar roots as culture has. The meaning of Sanskriti can be explained in relation to another Sanskrit word, Prakriti. Now let us look at the other element of classical conception in cultural discourses in India, that is cultivating or civilizing or refining the manners. We still use the meaning of culture in our day-to-day life. When we use culture in the sense of cultivation of cultured people, we are actually using it within a framework of hierarchy. Let us explain this to you with the Sanskrit word Sanskriti, which can be used as a translation of the English word culture. The word Sanskriti also has the similar roots as culture has. The meaning of Sanskriti can be explained in relation to another Sanskrit word Prakriti. Coming back to our previous argument that this meaning of culture is rooted in acceptance of existing social hierarchy implies that the term cultured people is used to refer to people and values of certain strata in society. This meaning either excludes the values of lower strata or denounces their social practices and rituals. For instance, M.N. Srinivas, in his celebrated book Religion and Society, among the Kuruks of South India, used the term Sanskritization to refer to the emulation of the practices and rituals of twice-born castes. The implicit connotation of such conceptualization is that the norms and rituals of twice-born caste are part of Sanskritic Hinduism. The discussion on these meanings of culture suffers from various limitations and invites criticisms from various corners. First and foremost, criticism is that emphasizes on the cultivation of higher values and qualities. The differentiation between high and low is problematic as it relies on existing social hierarchies. So the classical conception of culture privileges certain works and values over others. So the civilizational meanings of culture are now in its approach. Speaking with regard to the classical meaning of culture in Europe, Thompson states that it suffers from ethnocentric connotations, which means that the non-European societies were looked up as inferior and backward uncivilized. Hence, one of the colonial mission was to civilize these backward societies, which is also known as the white man's burden of civilizing others. It served as the ideological foundation for colonial expansion. You have learnt the civilizational meaning and also called the classical conception of culture that first developed in Europe in 16th century. Some of these elements were used in the cultural discourses in India too. The Orientalist and nationalist perspectives were guided by the civilizational perspective of culture that used culture and civilization synonymously to define Indian culture. In such overlapping usage of the words culture and civilization, it undermined the indigenous traditions of culture and civilization. On the contrary, appropriated a Western notion of civilization and culture in India. Friends, hope you enjoyed the lecture. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions that are given in the end of your text. Thank you very much indeed.